The most simple definition of Kurdish people are those that come from Kurdistan, a mountainous region in the Middle East which is right about here, a part of modern Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. The Kurdish people, Kurds from now on, are quite diverse people in what they believe in, most of them following Sunni Islam, but also practice Judaism, Kurdish Avalism, Shia Islam, and a bunch of other stuff. They also have their own language, which is unsurprisingly named Kurdish. With their own slew of folklore, music taste, and food, it might as well be their own nation. Oh, but that wouldn't track for their long and complex history. What is their history? Well, with Kurdistan being more of a region than a state, they have a lot going on at one time. The first time the region was given the name of Kurdistan was around the 11th century, but the history goes a bit farther back. The first time the Kurds started becoming their own forces around 770 with the Saduqians. At this time, most of the Middle East was controlled by the Abbasids, and would be for quite a while. The Saduqians in this case were just a small group of people doing their own thing. This is quite the recurring theme. The Saduqians did a bunch of stuff, mainly under the leadership of a guy named Zarak, but eventually he failed an invasion against Mosul, which was under control of the Abbasids in what we now call Iraq, and he was promptly executed. Later on, more dynasties would appear between 990 and 1015 AD. There were 5 dynasties at once. Coming along in 1037, the Seljuk Empire was founded and took over the entirety of the Middle East, kicking out the Abbasids. In 1115, the Khazaraspids came along and existed for just a long while. Eventually, the Seljuks decided to be nice and make a bunch of provinces. One of those provinces being Kurdistan, which is the first time the region actually had a unified rule over itself. Eventually, Kurdistan goes quiet for a little while other nations fight it out. And well, would you look at that, it's 1174, and the topic of today is Egypt. Going on over, it looks like it's a new dynasty. Who's the dynasty? It's the Ayyubids, led by a Kurdish guy named Saladin. After he just got a tiny bit of power and everyone above him kinda just died off. Eventually, it's the 16th century, and the Ottomans, who were first being led by Selim, and later on were being led by a guy named Suleiman with his even cooler looking hat, proceeded to take the entirety of the Middle East and Armenia, and proceeded onward. With the Kurds not liking the Ottomans, a bunch of revolts happening, some of them being just the following. In 1604, the Plight tribe eventually got a little bit of power, and the Ottomans made their leader a governor, but eventually he was executed for being a little bit late for a battle, also maybe being Kurdish, and the Plight tribe revolted. That didn't go well for him. In 1655, the Roziki revolt happened, which was led by a guy named Abdal. They took a little army and beat up some Ottomans, and eventually they were trapped in a town in which they were all killed and a bunch of civilians as well. Went quiet for a little while until 1830, when this guy Bedir Khan began a revolt at the same time as Muhammad Pasha. Even though they were both supposed to be fighting the Ottomans, they were more focused on fighting each other. Despite this, they did pretty well, as the Ottomans were distracted fighting Egypt. But eventually the Ottomans took care of the Egyptians and beat them all up in 1847. Tried again in 1879, but due to infighting, Kurdish tribes that revolted were betrayed and they all kinda died. Many other revolts happened during this time in the reign of the Ottoman Empire, but these are just a few of the examples, just so we have an idea of what was going on. And finally, it's time to talk about World War I. With World War I coming along, the Ottomans being a major player in it, the Kurds, seeing this as a great opportunity, decided to do a bunch of revolts. Because the Kurds were fighting the Ottomans, the British were kind of fond of this, so they promised the Kurds that if they did a bit of help, they would eventually be given a bit of their own country through the Treaty of Sevres. Eventually, the Kurds were fully on board, did a bunch more revolutions, and eventually the Ottoman Empire fell into more modern Turkey. The Kurds were ready to get nationizing, have their own country, and eventually a new final agreement was passed with the Treaty of Lausanne, which drew a bunch of new borders and didn't give the Kurds anything. and so their new region was stuck between Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And none of them were fans of each other or Kurds. On to more recent events. Turkey, after the Treaty of Lausanne, eventually started banning almost anything that wasn't Turkish, with their prime minister at the time, İsmet İnönü? Basically just saying, before the Turkish majority, other elements have had no kind of influence. At any price, we must Turkify the inhabitants of our land, and we will annihilate any who oppose. So he seems like a great guy. A bunch of revolts happened, nothing too fruitful came of it. A bunch of Kurds were oppressed and killed, and soon enough, two groups came along, the HDP and the PKK, who came along to try and liberate the Kurds from Turkey. The HDP being more of a political party, trying to bring things more democratically, through peace, negotiations, and the PKK using more violent means. Despite the PKK's efforts to get independence through terroristic means, Turkey hasn't given anything, and the war the PKK started is still going on despite drastically slowing down. With Turkey's current president Erdogan, a huge Turkish nationalist and autocrat looking to likely win the upcoming presidential election, things are not looking great. On the Iraqi side, since World War I, their government has had people come into power, promising the Kurds some land, independence, rights, which of course causes Kurdish population to vote for them. And then they do that, and none of it happens, and it screws over the Kurds even more. It's a vicious cycle that they're stuck in. During the Iran-Iraq War, the Kurds had another opportunity to take down the Iraqi government, but in the end it proved futile as Iran lost momentum in the war and the Kurds were just bombed. But as Hussein was thrown out of the government in 2003, the Kurdish population has become much more accepted, with Kurdish being an official language. But eventually, ISIS came into the picture, causing a bunch of chaos in the Middle East and Kurds being caught in the crossfire. However, the US came along, helped defeat ISIS, causing resurgence in Kurd power that was later crushed when war broke out. On the side of Iran, they haven't been a big fan of the Kurdish population either. Since the rise of Kurdish nationalism in the 20s, the Iranian government has constantly beaten them back, and this goes a bit far, causing the deaths of a bunch of Kurds and several revolts in the following years. This conflict has continued into today, where the government assassinated several Kurdish leaders in the early 2000s. Following these assassinations, revolts and protests have been filling the streets of Iran. More recently, the Iranian government has greatly lowered living conditions for Kurds, causing them to move constantly and even going to the extent of building dams to block waterways for Kurds. Syria has their own share of problems. Because of the nationalism in the 20s, the Syrian government decided to repress the Kurdish population. Over time, Kurds tried to overthrow the officials, but none of it succeeded, as the Syrian government proceeded to suppress the Kurds more and more. However, during the late 80s and 90s, the Syrian government was actually a big supporter of the Kurds' revolution in other countries like Turkey. Kinda weird how they did continue to do their own oppression. Eventually, Kurdistan fought to become a de facto independent state called Rojava with the help of the US. They're still fighting Syria to keep the state. When the US abandoned the Kurds in 2019, Turkey launched an invasion of their own. So, it seems that the fate of the Kurds might be sealed. A region and a people to be constantly oppressed, never to have their own land in the modern day, and having the ability to govern themselves. Unless some of the best options to help the Kurdish people is through foreign government affairs, stepping in and possibly adding a bit of pressure to those countries, or supplying aid. Nations like the US could take some ideas from the conflict in Ukraine, and if war were to flare up again in Syria or Iraq, the US could send military and humanitarian aid to those Kurdish rebels. or on the more peaceful method of having a multitude of governments put political pressure on the oppression nations, like sanctions or UN votes. These more peaceful options would aim not to create a country of Kurdistan, but to give them autonomy and promise of protection. But these, of course, are quite radical ideas and nothing that the common person can do. But for the common person, there are multiple relief funds to help Kurds. Some of the most noticeable ones being the Kurdish Refugee Relief Foundation, Joint Help for Kurdistan, and the Kurdish Aid Foundation. The situation with Kurdistan is complex and stems from hundreds of years of history. There's always a chance to give the people some freedom, the opportunity to no longer be oppressed and recognized as a region and a people. Kurdistan comes from roughly 1,000 years ago, and hopefully it isn't forgotten.